Hi, I'm Emily Strasser of The Bomb, and I'm this week's guest on MetaPod.
You're listening to MetaPod, where we unpack the web's most interesting podcasts and the stories behind them, hosted by Wendy Morrill and Kevin May.
So what do you remember best about your grandparents' house? Was it something decorative or maybe a smell or a particular room?
Not a smell or a picture or anything like that. My grandparents from my father's side lived in a small flat apartment about 2 miles from Big Ben in central London.
Mm-hmm.
In the small room that I would sleep in as a little boy, if I can remember back that far, I could never settle because all I could hear were the tube and metro trains rumbling along underneath. So that's probably my biggest abiding memory of their place.
So a sort of recurring sound and vibration, I guess. Did it ever prompt you to do anything?
Probably not to move into a house or apartment with noise coming from nearby forms of transport. But, hey, I now live just a few miles from Stansted Airport here in the UK. So I didn't really follow my own advice there, which wouldn't be the first time. But anyway.
Maybe you just like sonic booms, Kev.
Well, here you go. So a totally random side note here. We've had 2 sonic booms in the space of 6 months in my little town of Bishop Stortford. As a result, don't look so surprised. As a result of fighter jets escorting suspicious aircraft into land at the airport, I kid you not. They really do make a racket when they break the sound barrier on their way to intercept things flying around, as it were. Actually, what's happening now is there's some poor folk are trying to sue the Royal Air Force here for breaking their windows when these booms happen.
Ooh.
Anyway, as I said, a random side note. Please carry on, Wendy.
Well, our guest this week also has a story involving a boom, but the story actually starts with a rather unusual item in her grandmother's home, which is why I asked and what we're coming to in just a moment. But first, Kev, tell everyone what's happened this week.
Yeah, it's MetaPod's 10th episode.
Ooh, yay!
That's listeners. That's us sounding excited. Okay, right. So it's a
my hands are in the air.
Yeah, mine too. A momentous occasion. Yes, I know it's only double figures, but to mark this event, we're going to reach into MetaPod's burgeoning mailbag for the first time, and after this, we're going to read some fan mail after the interview.
Double figures, double trouble. Yeah, let's do that. That sounds exciting. I can't wait. I bet there's some funny stuff in there. But back to unusual and memorable items of grandparents here on episode 10 of MetaPod. As I was saying, our guest this week remembers a fairly extraordinary item that hung on the wall of her grandmother's home. It was a photograph of a man. It was actually the guest's grandfather. And he was standing in front of a nuclear mushroom cloud.
Yeah, that's right. So extraordinary, not only for the momentous occasion it captured, but the photo left such an impression on our guest, that's Emily Strasser, that questions about it led to her uncovering her family's history, which in turn led Emily to deep research, writing, and later activism.
Emily Strasser is narrator of The Bomb, a podcast produced by the BBC World Service. The Bomb explores the scientific and political events that led to the development and use of the atomic bomb. In particular, The Bomb highlights the role of scientist Leo Szilard in the discovery and application of nuclear fission.
Emily's grandfather was a chemist who worked on the Manhattan Project, which was the secret US government program during the latter stages of the Second World War. The Manhattan Project was devoted to developing an atomic weapon in a race against the Germans developing and having the same warfare capability. Emily has done a lot of research and writing on this topic. Her work is partly an effort to come to terms with her grandfather's contribution to the atrocity of the bomb being used against Japan in World War II. But it also goes beyond that and gets into institutional secrecy, personal versus institutional responsibility, and choices.
We talked to Emily about how it was to work with the BBC on the Bomb podcast, as well as the personal reconciliation process that she went through during a trip to Japan a few years ago. We also discussed the threats and choices that we all face today, the doomsday clock, and climate change. To come back to things that make a long and lasting impression, the doomsday clock is one of those, and you'll hear us talk a little bit more about that. Its time currently shows 100 seconds to midnight.
Right. Before we get into the interview, it's worth pointing out that Emily has asked us to note that her opinions expressed in the interview are her own and not necessarily those of her partners at the BBC production end of the podcast. Anyway, give me a noisy tube train any day rather than a doomsday clock hanging in my grandparents' house.
Okay, noisy subway it is for you, Kev. Let's start the tape. Emily Strasser, welcome to MetaPod. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. So glad to be here.
You're the narrator of the BBC World Service's podcast, The Bomb, which came out in August of 2020. I'd like to actually start at the end. You conclude The Bomb with a fairly stark set of words, and I'll just read those. Today, the doomsday clock stands at 100 seconds to midnight, the closest it has ever been. The choice is ours. I'm wondering if you could tell us what choices this story of the bomb podcast actually presents to listeners to start off.
That's a really great question. I guess in some ways, the whole arc of the podcast is one about choices about how we're going to take responsibility or not, how we choose to act, what we choose to act upon. So the podcast traces the life of Leo Szilard, who was this Hungarian physicist, a Jewish refugee from Germany, who conceived of the possibility of an atomic bomb when everybody else was sort of saying, oh, that's impossible. He convinced the US government that they needed to build an atomic bomb to prevent Hitler from getting one. And then after it was clear that the Germans were defeated, he did everything he could to stop it being used. So he feared an arms race. He was very prescient. So in a way, this story is a story of a man's choices about both sort of doing something really bold and unprecedented. He wasn't a well-known scientist when he advocated that the bomb be used, but he went to Einstein and he ultimately got the word to Roosevelt to say, this is a threat, you have to take this seriously. And then when he decided it wasn't a good idea and the risks were too great, he again tries to reach the president and tries to reach everybody. So he kind of takes the weight of the world upon himself. And so in that way, I think listeners can think about how their own choices in their own lives, in what ways do we, sort of step up when presented with an opportunity, when we have an idea, when we're convinced about something. And probably on the scale, none of us are, or not many of us are operating on the scale that Leo Szilard was, but we're all presented with those sorts of choices.
Right. So to come back actually to the first episode of the podcast, you describe a photo in your grandparents' home of your grandfather standing in front of an atomic mushroom cloud. Can you maybe tell us a bit about what your first memories of that photo were and how they changed over time as you grew up, and maybe at what point you decided to take action to learn more, as you said you've done?
That was a very vivid and kind of haunting memory I have from my childhood of this really kind of surreal photo of my grandfather in front of this kind of fiery mushroom cloud. As you do when you're a child, you don't really think that these sorts of things are strange, right? You just accept whatever is in your house, in your family is normal. This photograph was hanging in my grandmother's house. As a young adult, when I was in college, I started to think about that photograph and remember it and think, like, what was that about? Mm-hmm. That's so strange. Nobody I know has that kind of photograph on their wall. It's not a normal thing.
Sorry to laugh, but that's a good point.
No, it is. No, it's not. It is funny. I mean, it's a really wild, it's a really wild thing. And, grandmothers, like my grandmother was like a sweet, typical grandmother, like, and she has this atomic bomb photo. Like, it was really.
It's not an owl or anything.
Right. Yeah, I know. It's not. Like, and it was like, it was hung above the bed where I slept, like the kids' bed, you know, it was hung in the kids' room. It wasn't like, you know, so it's really weird. And by that time, my grandmother was dead. And, you know, I started asking my family, and I learned that my grandfather had been part of the Manhattan Project, so the US effort to build the atomic bomb in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, which was one of 3 secret cities built for the sole purpose of building the atomic bomb. So he was in Oak Ridge. Their whole purpose was enriching uranium for the first bomb, the bomb that was ultimately dropped on Hiroshima. And he had continued there through the Cold War. So he'd had kind of a long career in nuclear weapons. And this is something that my family had basically never talked about and didn't really know much about. Part of that was because it was highly secret for security reasons. And also there was a culture of secrecy. So I just got pretty interested. I mean, I was sort of puzzled by the photograph, puzzled by how this sort of huge history could be part of my family. But something that I didn't know about. And so I sort of started by talking to people who I knew, by talking to family members, family friends, reading books about Oak Ridge and about the Manhattan Project, and kind of spiraling outwards to get more and more context. And then also digging down and getting archival documents, getting some of my grandfather's work records from the plants.
So you're about college age, you said, when you start doing this?
Yeah. So it was about 10 years ago when I started, and yeah.
And how did you end up getting involved with the BBC?
Yeah, so it was honestly kind of random. I got an email on a normal day from a producer or researcher with the BBC who was working on this podcast, and they already had the topic. It was going to be about Leo Szilard, and she wanted to talk to me about being a presenter. And honestly, when I first read it, I was like, oh, they want to interview me about my grandfather, I guess. And I didn't totally understand what they had in mind until I talked to them. So I think what they were interested in is looking at the story of Leo Szilard, which is this story of this moral dilemma around the atomic bomb, as paired with me and my story and my grandfather. And it worked out well because I had been interested in Leo Szilard previously. As I was thinking about my grandfather's choices and his involvement, I had thought a lot about the people who made different choices and who took on different responsibilities.
Had you written about your grandfather at that point, and that's how they knew about your story?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so I published a lot of essays about that, and I guess they had a researcher who was really a good digger and found some of that work. So
okay. Do you know why they decided to tell Leo Szillard's story? What was the main message that they wanted to convey about his story?
So they wanted to do something for the 75th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima, and they were interested in a piece of history that maybe was less well known. And I think Leo Szilard is very interesting because he does encapsulate these sort of moral dilemmas. And so they were interested in these questions about science and inevitability and, you know, was there any way to stop it once this ball was set rolling? Was there more he could have done? Could he have turned things around? Did he do the right thing? Did he do enough? All of these kinds of moral questions.
I think what's quite interesting, Emily, is that for background to this interview today, as well as listening to the bomb over the summer 3 or 4 months ago, I watched a documentary also by the BBC from 2 or 3 years ago, which was called also called The Bomb, Nuclear Weapons. 2-hour documentary, really good. And interestingly, Leo Szilard is mentioned just a handful of times in there. There's a reference to him and when he wrote the letter to, I think it was Roosevelt, I think it was Roosevelt that he sent a letter to, or was it Truman, or both?
Well, yeah, he got Einstein basically to sign on to a letter, but yeah, that was sent to Roosevelt. Exactly.
Yeah, so, and in that documentary, he's mentioned only once or twice, as I said. I think it's quite interesting in the narrative of that particular documentary was just that he was just a small part of the overall story, and then 2 years on they've approached you and their narrative has changed, and I just wonder why you think they went down that route. Is it because of maybe it's at different kind of times? We want to be more reflective or something like that?
Maybe I'm a little bit hesitant to speculate because I wasn't part of those conversations or that earlier piece. I do think that the story you tell, as far as that first documentary, is sort of the more commonly told story.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Okay. And what do you think is, because he was, as you said at the beginning, Emily, he was excellent scientist. He'd kind of moved away from Germany. He did the work in London, and then he went to the US, and there was this big drive to push the science as far as he could. And I just wonder whether it was one moment or a series of moments that kind of turned his mind from being, I'm the scientist who wants to just do some amazing science, but now I'm understanding just how completely crazy this is. Or was it just the fact that Germany surrendered and the war in Europe was over?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really, really good question. I think he was a scientist who took joy in the pure discovery of things, right?
Right.
And a brilliant mind. But I think, at least according to his biographer, and I'm thinking specifically of William Lenwet, who we interviewed on the podcast, he was also quite an idealistic man, and that was always sort of part of him. He always sort of had this drive to better humanity. And part of the tragedy of him is that he sort of thought that the bomb was going to better humanity because it was going to save us from this terrible force of the Germans. And then later on, the calculus changes. But later in his life, he continued to, work for disarmament and work for peaceful uses of nuclear energy. And then also went into molecular biology and was studying things like, aging and the immune system and viruses. So he was always sort of driven by this desire to help humanity, even if sometimes it led to consequences that he wouldn't have chosen.
I know we're kind of jumping ahead here a little bit, but I think this is in the thread of what we're discussing now. I mean, in his later life, was he very open about his anxiety that he had around, I would assume, around June, July of 1945, ahead of what happened in August when the first bomb was dropped on a civilian population?
Yeah, so he was very outspoken about, after the war, about trying to organize international arms control. He wasn't the only scientist. A lot of the former Manhattan Project scientists wanted that. Yeah. They wanted more transparency and less secrecy. They wanted, to prevent an arms race. So he wasn't shy about that. Interestingly, the petition that he started was actually classified by the US government until 1961, which I find really interesting because it obviously contained no science and no secret. They didn't want anyone to know that the scientists had spoken up against the bomb.
Is that because, do you think, at the time, it was the height of the Cold War, is on the eve of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I guess to have exposed doubts in the whole arms race by eminent scientists would have perhaps ruined the government's narrative at the time?
Yeah, I would speculate that that's what it had to do with. I don't know for certain about that document, but there are a lot of cases of things that were classified. Coverage of Hiroshima, there was a lot of coverage that was suppressed or censored in the US. So it wouldn't have been the only case of them holding something back because they wanted to allay public fear about nuclear bombs. And exactly.
So what I found interesting about the podcast was Leo Szillard's breathing. Sorry, again, I'm laughing here.
Tell us, Wendy, because I can't recall the breathing episode, or was it something that was ongoing all the way through?
I can't remember when it starts, but I sort of thought, did I just hear that? Did I hear a person sort of, not struggling, but like obviously tense about something, like, or I was getting a feeling of this sort of eccentric academic that's maybe just busy thinking all the time and, I don't know, rushed or harried or whatever. And I'm also thought, like, did I hear that correctly? I mean, were you involved in the soundscape at all, or did you work with that when you were narrating, or was it added afterwards?
Yeah, so that all the sound stuff, I really had no hand in that, but it was really fun for me to hear once it was put together. It was really astonishing to me to hear like how well they had crafted the sound and the music. I thought just added so much to the mood of it. So Yeah.
Especially the breathing, clearly. If it hadn't have,
especially apparently, yeah. I mean, yeah. So yeah, it was Trevor Garekis did the music, and I remember when I first heard the score, I was just, I mean, of course, we know the power of sound on a podcast about podcasts, but the way that music can create a mood where I knew what was happening, and I still felt all kinds of like tension and poignancy and suspense, right? And I think the same thing with, as you said, the breathing, right? Like the mood that created for you.
What are the ideal conditions to listen to the bomb? I mean, does it need to be quiet so you can hear that breathing? Or actually, there's one episode where I feel like you're whispering a little bit as well, and I can't remember which one it is. And maybe that's just the conditions you had to work in one day.
Yeah, the ideal conditions. I mean, I think a good set of headphones are good so that, so you can hear that sound effect.
Yeah.
I don't know. I tend to be a person who has trouble sitting still, so I like to listen to podcasts while walking on good headphones, kind of move around. Yeah, the conditions of recording it, of course, in these times were homemade sound studio in my bedroom, which involved like totally dismantling. I had to put mattresses in front of the windows, and we had one spare mattress, but
and there.
Yeah, it was wild. And had to like, I don't have many mattresses, right? So I had to like unmake my bed every day and like put it against the window and build it. So
I can recommend a very good IKEA one with a zipper down the middle, actually.
Oh, okay. Well, for my next.
MetaPod has very technical equipment.
Nice.
As the narrator, you tell many of the vignettes throughout that move the broader story along. And some of those are actually told by other people that you interview, other voices. You tell the story about the Norwegian heavy water, and then someone else is telling the story of the Napoleon-era brandy breakfast. They're all done really well. They're short and convincing. How was it for you to try and convey a story about people and an era that you were not present in?
Sure, yeah.
Did you need to get into character somehow, or did you think about certain emotions or surroundings?
Yeah, I mean, I think I did really rely on the sort of richness of the details of the people that were interviewed for the podcast. So there was so much sort of historic richness that these mosaic of experts were able to offer. So being able to kind of soak in that and imagine the scenes they were describing, I sort of tried to inhabit those places. Like I sort of remember, I think it's maybe in the first episode where we talk about Zillard moving to Berlin and sort of the contrast between Budapest and Berlin, and how, there was all this noise and lights and music and dancing. And so sort of feeling what those places might have been like. Or another one that I think of is the scene where he's on the train escaping from Germany and is interviewed by the German officer. And I remember just feeling the tension of that moment kind of in my body about how incredibly frightening that must have been.
Yeah. There aren't that many episodes in the series, and actually each episode is quite short. In fact, I often felt they weren't long enough. They're usually ended with a nice bit of a cliffhanger. Were there, decisions made about that for a certain reason that you know of?
So I wasn't as involved in that portion, except I know that they were wound up being longer than they had originally been designed. So the original concept was there were going to be 2 1-hour radio specials that were going to be broken into podcasts. So I think they were just going to make that all sort of self-contained, and the entire length would have just been 2 total hours. But there was just so much more material that they had to compress things to fit. So they did broadcast 2 1-hour specials. But obviously that left out a lot of the podcast itself.
Could you tell us, Emily, a little bit about your visit to Japan? Hopefully you'll forgive me for saying I hoped that was going to be a longer part of the podcast. It's mentioned and you went there and you interviewed people. And I was really quite captivated by the fact that you were either driven to go there because you were writing or, narrating this story. And just give us a kind of the overview of why you went and what happened there, and any bits that happened while you were there that you would like to have perhaps included in the actual final podcast, because I thought that was a really great bit.
Sure. Yeah, thanks. So I went in 2015 for the 70th anniversary of the bombing. And I had felt for a long time that I needed to go there as kind of a completion of my journey to sort of face what had happened there and the place that it happened, to interview survivors. I was pretty nervous about how that would go, kind of emotionally, like how I would be able to take that in. Super beautiful and interesting place. What I think I didn't expect is there is, though thinking back, maybe I should have. Of course, a lot of people come there to visit survivors and interview survivors. And so there is kind of a system set up for that. You can kind of go to the museum, the Peace Museum, and request interviews with survivors, and they'll help set you up. There are English speaking survivors, or there are, ones that you can use an interpreter. I had an interpreter for most of my interviews. And I got sort of interested in like, what are the stories that aren't being told so much, because so much of the story is being told not in a way that's right. It's not repetitive, because every person's experience matters and has so much richness and detail to it. But you sort of wonder what are the less, and this was my interest, I guess, in the whole book. What are the stories that we don't know? What are the secrets? Yeah. So that's why the one interview, sort of detailed interview that we were able to include in the podcast is with Minoru Haraguchi, who was the one-time director of the Peace Museum. And he was so interesting because he did have this different take that I hadn't really heard from anybody else, where he had some anger about the bombing, and he was sick of the bombing. Like, he had kept his status as a survivor a secret for most of his life because he didn't want to be seen as a victim, and he didn't want his life to be controlled by this narrative. And so I think I was really drawn to just those moments that didn't necessarily fit with some of the other stories I was hearing. I mean, every story is so moving and so visceral, and there are a lot of times that I was moved to tears.
Yeah. What did they make of you? Because presumably, I'm assuming that you would have disclosed that you were there, and your interest in it is because of your grandfather. And how did that dynamic, if that's the right word, kind of play out once they realized your own personal history was, of course, also connected to Hiroshima in some slightly different way to their own?
Yeah, so I did disclose absolutely right away. I wouldn't have wanted to trick anyone about that. Most people were not actually surprised, and I think that's a product of, I'm not the first person who's come who has a connection to this history. And so that was really interesting. Like Truman's grandson has done some things in Hiroshima. Yeah. And around the same time, this was actually sort of funny that I was there. Everywhere I went, someone would say, "Oh, this guy, Ari Besser, was just here. His grandfather was the only man who was on both missions to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And he's about my age." And so there was this strange sense that I felt like I was almost in this pageant that I didn't know I was a part of. Yeah. So there were a couple people who were surprised, who were people who were more newly telling their story, people who had been kind of more secretive or had kept that private. And so I was again interested in those more unexpected encounters. But people were very, very gracious and offered a lot of forgiveness very freely, which is sort of astonishing.
Is it something that kind of almost getting away from the podcast itself, but I sense it was, and you said that it was something that you felt you had to do once you had returned home to the US, where you now live? Did it take a lot of time to kind of decompress and understand what you had done, but also the people that you had met? And, you mentioned the word forgiveness, kind of just absorb all that. I mean, what did it kind of mean to you once you'd got home?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in some ways, it just was this kind of emotional culmination of all of these years of research that I'd done, and this years of trying to understand how I felt about this. Yeah. And I felt like I was able to let go a bit after I had completed this trip. And part of it was about the forgiveness, but also part of it was about this feeling I got afterwards that ultimately this story is about individual stories are not as much the point. My grandfather's story is not as much the point as this kind of larger sense of collective responsibility. My grandfather was this one man who had one piece in this that he could control only a very little, unlike Leo Szilard, who had much bigger of a role. But, the sense I had from from the hibakusha, the survivors, were, we don't hold him responsible. He was part of the system. And I had been so hung up on this idea of individual responsibility. And I think at the end, I started to feel like maybe that I was looking in the wrong place, and that there's this more collective cultural responsibility.
Yeah, I'm interested, and forgive me if you think it's insensitive, but would you have made that visit and gone on this endeavor with both your original research and the podcast if your grandfather was still alive?
That's a great question. I don't know, because I never knew him. And so he died before I was born.
Right.
And so part of the mystery of him was always, who was he? And if I had known him, that probably would have been more complicated, because I would have had this emotional attachment. I don't know, like, I like to think I still would have done it, but it's sort of impossible to know. It's certainly harder to write about people who are alive, I think.
Yeah. Your family that are around you still, what kind of feedback, to give it an official word, have they kind of given you to what you were doing in 2015 and the trip, and more recently the podcast?
Yeah, they've been really, really supportive and really open, which has been great, because I wasn't sure what I would encounter. I sort of mentioned briefly the culture of secrecy around Oak Ridge and nuclear stuff, and I haven't really talked so much right now, but another part of the journey was following my grandfather's mental health and sort of how that was tied up in his work. And they've been very gracious and open about helping me, and kind of, I think it's caused them to reflect a bit on the culture that we grew up in. So yeah, that has been interesting. And they all have, listened to the podcast and really, I think enjoyed it, and enjoyed seeing the ways that we were able to incorporate a little bit of George's story within this larger history.
If I can come back to Leo Szilard for a moment, I think he's referred to as the consummate networker at some point in the podcast, and just getting to this point of individual versus institutional or structural choices and power. I mean, he was in exile, but he had quite a network. And I think with that came quite a lot of privilege to do and go the places that he went. And there were other people that followed a similar trail, I think, to the US. I guess my question is, what was his balance of self-interest and institutional power, or playing that? And was it fair and just?
He was the consummate networker, and he was good at being friends with important people. He was also sometimes not good at that, because he was irritable and difficult to be around. And that comes up, also in this history. He and Leslie Groves, who was the military head of the Manhattan Project, really butted heads a lot, to the point that Leslie Groves was having him followed by security and trying to get him locked up as an enemy alien. So he wasn't very diplomatic. So he was a networker, but he also was not that good at always getting important people on his side. I think he was a man with a lot of integrity who tried to do what he thought was fair and just. And certainly he had a lot more power and access than most people do. And I guess, as anyone with power, some of his choices maybe backfired or caused harm.
Do you have the sense that he acknowledged that? I guess I don't get that impression from the podcast, or I don't know a lot about his story. So
it's impossible to know historically, right, what would have happened with the bomb if he hadn't gotten Einstein to write this letter to Roosevelt. Would we have an atomic bomb? Was that science inevitable? Would, somebody else have had one first? I guess you could make an argument that he could be the villain in this story, because he was the one who brought this to the world. But it really could. I don't know. I don't know what would have happened if not for him and his choices and his networking.
The point about him being seen as a villain is an interesting one.
I think another vignette in the podcast is this breakfast meeting between Alexander Sachs and President Roosevelt. The person telling the story just says something that seems so relevant currently, that science won't be the way to turn the president around. So he tells him a story. And then he tells this story about someone making a sales pitch, essentially, to Napoleon for a boat that doesn't need sails. I just find that a remarkable play of power there, or maybe it's just the way that it's described. What do you make of that? What relevance do you think it has today in the climate change debate?
Yeah.
And a certain president that we all know.
Sure, outgoing. I love that story too. I think it's so great, and I wonder what is that silver bullet story that we need to turn this around. I'm glad you,
or the brandy, I guess,
or the brandy, the breakfast brandy. Yeah, yeah. Maybe we all need more breakfast brandy. I'm glad you brought up climate change, because I was thinking about it when you asked the first question about what choices we have. Actually, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, their doomsday clock, it was created to look at nuclear midnight, at the idea of nuclear annihilation. But now they actually incorporate climate change into their calculations. And so part of the reason that they have us so close to midnight, and now it's closer than it has been even since the height of the Cold War, is because of climate change. And that's a big piece of the existential crisis facing us now. So I think it's an apt comparison to think about nuclear weapons and climate change. So yeah, I wish I knew what the boat without sails story was
for today.
Yeah, for today. I don't know. Maybe it's the nuclear bomb. Maybe someone is like, what if Roosevelt didn't make that decision to go ahead with the bomb? And depending on what side of that debate you land on, whether that was a good choice or a bad choice, I guess.
Right.
I think related to that, Emily, is I wonder whether you think we, from a nuclear perspective, are a safer world now than we were in the 50s and the 60s.
Yeah, so I will say I'm not an expert on nuclear security, just somebody who's read a lot and become sort of personally obsessed.
Same here, but I think it's a valid point.
yeah I do think nuclear wise, I think that we have fewer weapons now, and we're less kind of at least as far as like the US and the Soviet Union, right, we're less on a hair trigger. We're not doing above ground tests, so we're not or below ground tests. Other countries are, but the US is not. And so we're not just like unleashing tons and tons of radiation into the atmosphere, which is its own threat. Of course, we have different instabilities now, more countries who have nuclear weapons, rogue states that fear. So there are new fears.
Yeah, I think that's kind of where I'm either sit or don't sit, is that, in the 50s and the 60s, at the height of the Cold War, you had two superpowers that were terrified of each other. So because you had MAD, mutually assured destruction. So there was, almost there was a slightly perverse stability, because there was the superpowers, whereas now you've got the US with its arsenal, and you've got India and Pakistan and China and the UK and France and Israel. It's emerged, and all those kind of things. There's more states with nuclear weapons, so you could actually say that we are in a less stable nuclear environment now, because there aren't two people that are so shit scared of using them as they were in the 50s and the 60s.
Yeah, I think I can really convince myself either way,
Interesting. Yeah.
Are there technologies currently, or that you see on the horizon in the next 5 or 10 years, that you're quite concerned about?
Other than Facebook?
Right. That one's already doing its damage. I mean, interestingly, we were talking about the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, and they talk about their sort of, for their latest statement about how close we are to midnight, they cited both nuclear insecurity and climate change. And the third thing they cited was cyber warfare, which sort of undermines our efforts to respond to the other two. And so I think that is very scary, but it's not, I don't know, I'm most scared about climate change, really, and our ability to respond to it. That feels like the biggest existential threat to me right now.
To come back a little bit to where we started, is what choices do you think people have today about science and technology and how they're applied in society?
Yeah. I mean, I do think it goes back to this thing about collective responsibility and structural change. I think we can get really caught up individually about like, oh, do I or do I not use Facebook, right? Or like, am I recycling all of my bottles? And it's good to recycle, and it's good to be like mindful about our choices of consumption. But the thing that's going to actually make a difference as far as climate change goes are big institutional structural changes. And so advocating for technologies like sustainable energies or transportation that has a lower carbon footprint, or, housing, all of these, I don't know, there's lots of technology and there's lots of scientific brilliance. And if you can build a thing like an atomic bomb, if you can have a Manhattan Project, can't we have a Manhattan Project for climate change? What would it look like if we said we're putting all of the scientific brains into that instead of making a smaller iPhone? What if it was about solving climate change?
It's a really good point, though. I mean, I'm curious. We've got Elon Musk and SpaceX throwing, cars playing David Bowie into orbit around the Earth, right. And these things cost billions of dollars and things like that. And I'm sure Elon, if he was able to speak for himself, which we know he can, but if he was here, he would probably say, well, I've created Tesla, which is an electric car and stuff like that. But just something like the space race. If you think about the space race in the 60s, it cost millions and billions to put 6 missions on the moon, I think it was, in the end, and all the rest of the Apollo and the Gemini projects and stuff like that. And there is so much other science, expensive science, that happens now that, to your point, perhaps isn't aimed in the right direction. I mean, do you have hope that science can, or the wealth behind science can be directed to things, as we say, may help save us, as it were?
Yeah.
Or are we just dazzled by the bright lights of other things, do you think, as a race?
I mean, I think for it to shift, people have to feel like they're actually in danger, including corporations.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah.
And maybe that's what happened with nuclear weapons. Like, we felt like we were really, really scared. And we're not scared enough about climate change because it is subtler.
Yeah.
Unless you're like in Australia and bushfire,
No, that's a terrific point. Yeah. Right at the end of the bomb, Emily, there's a fairly kind of heartfelt plea, if that's the right word. And you become less of a narrator and more of, it's your kind of perspective. And I just wondered how much of how you came, personally, what you had to do to get you to that point, from just telling a story, albeit about your grandfather and his connection to the bomb, to actually putting some of your own opinion into the back end of that tale.
So I think that was accurate to sort of the journey that I went on, that I kind of described, from this sense of this preoccupation with the past, with a sense of guilt and inherited guilt, as I call it, and responsibility, to this feeling of like we are in a precarious place and an urgency of our current moment. So I was pleased that we were able to end on a moment of currency and urgency.
So what is next for you? Do you have another podcast coming? Are you working on other projects?
Yeah, so I don't have another podcast right now, but would love to in the future if that opportunity arises.
You've got the mattresses.
I've got the mattresses. I've got my microphone, and I've learned how to set up a home studio, how to build a pop shield out of a stocking and a
very good
coat hanger, which is a new skill for me. So I'm ready. But yeah, I mean, so I actually have a book that is about my grandfather in Oak Ridge, and that is not published yet, but I've been working on it, and hope that someday it will be in the world. So that's kind of my biggest project, and then I'm always working on essays here and there.
Emily Strasser, thank you for joining us on MetaPod.
Thank you, Emily.
Thank you so much. It's been so fun.
Great. Thank you to Emily for sharing her personal stories and opinions alongside the story of Leo Szilard as told in The Bomb. You can listen to all episodes of The Bomb and read more about Leo Szilard on the BBC World Service website.
You can also learn about Emily and her work at emilystrasser.com, or follow her on Twitter. That's at Emily Strasser. That's with an A for Strasser. As always, we've put links on the MetaPod website for you.
I can't get over the idea of the photograph of her grandfather with a mushroom cloud. My Nana loved mushrooms, the ones that were popular in the 70s.
Really? That might explain a lot.
The decorative ones, Kevin. Not the psychedelic or the atomic ones, for that matter. Anyway, yeah, a mushroom cloud of an atomic nature is another thing.
Right, so let's get into the arguably the other most really important thing about today's episode, which is diving into the MetaPod mailbag to celebrate our 10th episode.
Yeah.
So a listener from Ireland I quote, "MetaPod is great. The quality of your guests brings it all together." Thank you, listener from Ireland. We're trying to bring you the most interesting guests that we can. So here we go. Here's another one, a listener from Scotland. Just been catching up on MetaPod. Well done. It's developing really nicely. An eclectic bunch of characters. I'm assuming that's the people that we interview and not us. It's good to hear that people...
I don't know.
Right. So anyway, thank you. It's good to hear that people appreciate the wide range of topics and people on the show.
All right, my turn to reach into the mailbag.
Okay. Russell.
A listener from the Netherlands. It seems like your guests really enjoy talking to you. Wow, that's really nice to hear.
Yeah.
I mean, Kev can be pretty difficult sometimes.
That's true. I accept that. But anyway, go
I
on.
guess we manage.
Yeah. Another one? Got another one?
I do.
Okay.
A listener from England. Thank you for making MetaPod and for creating a quality podcast filter for what to listen to in lockdowns in the UK. While I have very much enjoyed all of the episodes, the ones about death have been especially good.
Oh, you'll like this one then, the bomb. Anyway.
There's more. Hold on, Kev. By the way, the Ice Valley woman was definitely a spy, killed by someone, maybe a Nazi hunter.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
The one that has made me laugh the loudest was Mark Thomas's episode. His irreverent humor was clear to see, and many of his ways reminded me of me.
Right.
He was clearly on good form when you spoke to him. I was very disappointed about the Weird Hit Wonder episode when Kev did not mention the Flying Pickets singing Yazoo cover song, Only You. Cheers.
Okay, listen.
What do you have to say for yourself, Kev?
I will reply.
Explain to the listener.
I will reply to our listener from England with a heartfelt apology for not mentioning the Flying Pickets.
I bet you will.
I hope he'll forgive me. Right, so our final one. Oh, no, it's two more. Hang on a second. So a listener from the Netherlands. I really like the idea of a sonic hug. Going to check that podcast out. Oh, that's great, actually. Please do. As we said when we talked about that particular podcast in our interview with Helena, it's a really, really terrific podcast and a great resource for those who may be experiencing some mental health issues of their own. And okay, one more. So a listener from the US. Okay, so we're going across the Atlantic. So episode 6 was my favorite episode of MetaPod so far. I love weird music like Detachable Penis. Right, that would be, for the sake of clarity, that would be our interview with Adsa de Vries of Weird Hit Wonder. We're very glad you liked it, and good luck with your detachable thing.
Yeah, good luck with your detachable thing. That sounds handy. I mean,
Stop it.
It's actually a funny song by King Missile. I think that came out in the early 90s, so you can look it up.
Okay, right. We'll keep reaching out for more. We'll keep reading more out in the future. We'd especially like to hear from listeners with their feedback on particular episodes. In particular, we know that the Death in Ice Valley episode really got people going by what we've read on social media and the mailbag letter that we read out just now. In fact, I don't know if I told you about this, Wendy. I had an email from a listener. A criminology student, no less, as I was back in the old days, who had some very strong theories about who the Isdal woman might be or not be. Yeah, so keep them coming, please. And that reminds me, I must reply to his email with my own theories. Anyway, that's it from the mailbag, I think, Wendy.
All right. Well, we appreciate hearing from you, listeners. So please keep the comments and questions coming. And please keep rating and reviewing us on your favorite podcast platforms. Those really help to spread the good word of the MetaPod. And happy 10th episode, Kev.
Thanks. Right. Okay. So it shouldn't surprise listeners that Wendy and I have actually yet to see one another in person since we started MetaPod. You know, lockdown and coronavirus and all that. So a well-deserved cake we can share will have to wait, I'm afraid, Wendy.
I like cake. I'll wait.
Okay.
Maybe by the time we hit 50, we can have some cake.
That'll be...
And I mean episodes, not years. Although some of us are closer than others.
Okay. I had a feeling you might say something like that. Okay.
Okay. For now, that's it from us, especially me. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
That's it for MetaPod this time. Thanks for listening. MetaPod will be back soon with another unpacking of the web's most interesting podcasts. But in the meantime, make sure to subscribe at any of the usual places you find your other favourite podcasts. We'd hate for you to miss upcoming episodes, and we'd love it if you left us a review. You can let us know what you think of this episode by going to metapodshow.com. We'll see you next time. MetaPod is produced by Wendy Morrill and Kevin May,